Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Peace Action of Staten Island's Forum on the U.S. Exit from Afghanistan. Peace Action is happy to host this forum tonight to examine the U.S. exit from Afghanistan. There are so many questions that need to be answered. Why did the U.S. invade Afghanistan and then occupy it for 20 years? Is this exit a move away from endless wars, or is it forging a new path to new conflicts? What does the future hold for the women of Afghanistan? And what about the refugee crisis that is happening as a result of this decision? Tonight, we are joined by panelists who will address these concerns and more. I would like to give a warm welcome to our panelists, Brittany Ramos DeBarros, Mortaza Delari, Kathleen Foster, and Dr. Zaia Wahab. In a moment, I will turn the program over to our co-hosts who will be moderating tonight, Dave and Debbie Polchak, who are both board members of Peace Action. But first, I would like to take a moment to just mention some new business. On Saturday, November 13th, Peace Action will hold their annual Make Food Not War dinner. Now, because of COVID, it will be done virtually. But our keynote speaker will be Vincent Intandi, author of African Americans Against the Bomb. Learn about the role African Americans played in imposing nuclear weapons. They were some of the first voices to speak out. They were able to make the connection between nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and racism. We will be honoring people from the Staten Island community who were and are involved in opposing nuclear weapons, who are fighting for peace in this world. I would also like to take a moment to talk about membership in PASI. Why is membership so important? Your contribution helps us to continue our work and support others involved in the fight for justice and peace in our community. And by being a member of Peace Action, you make it possible for PASI to be a stronger voice against war and why we should use diplomacy to resolve conflicts. Your joining and being a part of PASI will help to raise awareness about the bloated defense budget that robs us of the resources needed for healthcare, jobs, and education. So please think about becoming a member if you are not one already. You can put your contact information in the chat and someone will contact you. So without further ado, I want to say again, welcome to our forum. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Debbie and Dave Polchak, co-hosts for tonight's program. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to, and we have the privilege of Dr. Zaia Wahab, a professor at Lewis and Clark Graduate School of Education and Counseling, all the way from Portland, Oregon. He accepted our invitation and we're very grateful to him to speak tonight. He taught full-time at the American University of Afghanistan in 2013 until October 2019. And he has conducted 2 master's programs for university instructors throughout Afghanistan. So we're very honored to have him speak tonight. Dr. Wahab.
Yes. Thank you very much. Good evening and greetings again from Portland, Oregon. I'd like to thank you all for organizing this event, especially with the declining interest in the corporate press regarding Afghanistan. You may have noticed that the corporate press, after using up the drama and the trauma of the airport, Kabul airport episode, is not showing much interest in the pain and suffering of Afghans, the pain and suffering that is actually increasing by the minute. The millennium started with two major crimes. One was the crime of 9/11, the 19 terrorists who attacked the United States and killed many, many innocent people and caused much pain and suffering. That was a major crime of the century. But there was also a second crime, I would say, and that is when the United States and its allies attacked Afghanistan on October 7, 2001. I say this was a crime. The invasion and the occupation was a crime because Afghanistan itself had very little to nothing to do with the crime of 9/11. But even if it did, 9/11 was a crime and it should have been dealt with as a police intelligence criminal case and not penalizing a whole country for the crime committed by a few individuals who, again, had very little to do with Afghanistan. The United States attacked Afghanistan because it was President Bush needed to do something presidential, especially when he himself was in trouble, the way he became president. But also it was sort of a revenge. It was a reflexive response to a trauma and a major crime and attack. But also I would say there were some other reasons. And the United States attacked Afghanistan because it wanted to reassert itself. The US wanted to reassert its hegemony, its quote, self-styled leadership position in the world, and being a peacemaker and being the leader of the world, but also to sort of remind friends and foes who actually had the power and who was in charge. And the attack on Afghanistan was also a way to rehearse for the next attack on Iraq. Although I should point out that the attack on Afghanistan actually, the decision was made in the summer preceding the 9/11, and again had very little or nothing to do with the events of the 9/11. So there were many reasons for the United States to attack Afghanistan, and it did. And then it decided to stay on for 20 years. Although I think the United States, the attack was unnecessary. It was illegal, it was immoral, and it was criminal. And I think it should have left Afghanistan immediately after the attack, but it didn't. It stayed on, and at one point, as you know, there were armies from 40 different countries occupying Afghanistan, where they had about 150,000 foreign troops and that many contractors and so forth. And the United States spent about $2 trillion on the war and 2,500 American soldiers and many, many contractors and other people, and hundreds of thousands of Afghans, civilians, combatants, insurgents, journalists, lawyers, and so forth. So the US attack and occupation of Afghanistan was a major disaster and a crime, and it was a major attack on the very foundation of the Afghan society. And then the United States, all of a sudden, at the end of August, decided to leave. It left without consulting, without informing, without telling even people, the guards at the Bagram airport, without telling its allies or the Afghan puppet government. But I think it's important in the aftermath of the US withdrawal, Afghanistan now is, everybody would say this, Antonio Guterres, the UNHCR, the head of the WHO, the head of the European Union, many government leaders like Putin, Xi, Imran of Pakistan, and so forth. Now, everyone and some of these people have been to Afghanistan in the last week or two or so, would point out that Afghanistan is on the verge of complete collapse. So the US and its allies, and in conjunction with the Afghan puppet government, did very little to prepare Afghanistan to sort of be self-sufficient, self-reliant, and feed itself, take care of itself, house its people, and serve the people. But we find out now that with the US and its allies departing and the Afghan government mafia escaping with truckloads of US dollars, Afghanistan is on the verge of collapse, economic, political, social, and cultural. The Taliban took over because no one defended the previous government, because no one cared for the previous government. It was not considered legitimate, it was ineffective, it was inefficient, and it was corrupt beyond description. So poor Afghanistan now. I am in touch with friends and colleagues. We talk literally every day, and I read both languages. I read the Afghan press. And so the vast majority of the people at this point are hungry. There's not enough food, not enough medicine. The internally displaced live in the open. There are millions of internally displaced people, and also many Afghans are trying to leave the country in whatever way they can. So we're witnessing the complete collapse of a country that has thousands of years of history. So I would say the United States and its puppet mafia in Afghanistan are directly responsible for the pain, for the suffering, for the misery, for the starvation, and for the difficult conditions that Afghans live in with a very uncertain future. And I want to just suggest, what the United States and the world community should do. The United States should unfreeze the $10 billion Afghan money that is in the US Reserve Bank. The US should allow the IMF and the World Bank to unfreeze the funds that was to go to Afghanistan. The US and its allies are responsible, and they should deliver massive amounts of humanitarian aid. There should be no sanctions imposed on Afghanistan. And the Taliban, whether the world likes it or not, they are the ones who took the country over and are in power. And even though in many ways their conduct looks medieval, but they are the ones who now control the country, and you have to work with them. So the US and its allies should recognize the Taliban, but of course, provisionally, and then try to deal with them. There should be no campaign by the United States and its allies of any kind against the Afghan government or the Afghan people. The relationships should be normalized. And the United States and its allies should pay Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan, reparation. And also the world community should repatriate all the money that was stolen by the Afghans, the Americans, and the Afghan Americans and others, and was taken out of the country. That money should be repatriated and restored to Afghanistan. The United States should end all kinds of subversion, all kinds of psychological warfare, and all kinds of sanctions and restrictions on Afghanistan. And the United States should end all kinds of war and aggression, whether it's over the horizons, quote unquote, whether it's drones, whether it's through the US supporting Al-Qaeda or Daesh, or through other means. And the United States and the world community should guarantee the independence, neutrality, autonomy, and territorial integrity of Afghanistan. The US and the world community should empower, it should fund, and it should authorize and support a UN peacekeeping and development force to operate in Afghanistan, slow down the crises, and prevent any kind of civil war. And finally, the world community should convene tribunals to try all kinds of warlords, whether they're in Washington, in Kabul, and in other places. And the UN, the United States, should convene they should convene a truth commission to get to the bottom of this major crime, get to the bottom of what Whitlock tells us in the Afghanistan papers. So the United States and the allies broke Afghanistan into thousands of small pieces. The United States and its allies are politically, legally, and morally responsible to, as quickly as possible, repair Afghanistan so that Afghans can live in peace, prosperity, and harmony. Thank you.
Unmute me. Because Dr. Wahab has another meeting, we're going to open for questions. Please enter your questions in the chat now and he'll respond to you.
Thank you.
If you have any. No?
I haven't.
Everyone knows everything. No
No.
Is it okay if we
type that fast?
is it okay if we unmute people, Debbie, to make it a little easier?
Yeah, or they can raise their, there's a reaction button at the bottom of their screen. They can just raise their hand.
Yeah. People are welcome to disagree, to ask questions, to challenge me, to do whatever they want to say. It's a free country. And let's
I have a quick
Okay,
question.
wait a second. I'm going to help with that. And the first question is from Neil Frumpkin. You're recognized. You can unmute yourself. I think you are. Please ask your question.
And I took the warbler off the screen.
Yes.
So
there are, as you know, am I to speak? You know, the United Nations and several of its agencies are very active in Afghanistan. UNHCR, the World Health Organization, UNEMA, you know, and other organizations are in fact active. Doctors Without Borders, you know, in many other Afghan and third world country agencies that are active. And the Taliban, if we're to believe them, say that, you know, they will support. They, in fact, Taliban are screaming and asking the world community to please help develop Afghanistan, or please help feed and heal the people. So yes, there are organizations, other than if you have personal contacts with people who would work.
Neil?
yes, thank you. Thank you, Kathy, for organizing this forum, first of all. First, I wanted to say that while it's certainly this what is being called a 20-year war, Dr. Wahab mentioned that planning for it started before the invasion. And I remember seeing the film Mr. Wilson's War, which detailed the intervention on the part of the US through paying for insurgents, which included, we remember, somebody named Osama bin Laden, who was trained by the CIA
Yes.
in fighting against the Soviet-backed government that
Yes.
the U.S. wanted to see gone. So I think the war is beyond 20 years old,
Yeah, it's
at least
40.
by 10 years.
Right.
My question is, it seems to me that the turn from Afghanistan is not so much an act in building a more peaceful world, but rather a more directed preparation for war, which I think both Democrats and Republicans view as the Chinese and to a lesser degree, perhaps the Russian, that they view as enemies, and that they are preparing for a greater war, not shirking or leaving a smaller war, but rather girding themselves and preparing for a broader war. What is your feeling about that?
Yes, good points. I should also point out that many of you know John Pilgers, the Australian writer, filmmaker. He also has a film, and at the time, many of us made this point that the decision to attack Afghanistan was made in the summer of 2001 and not in September of 2001. So that's a matter of record now. But also we should say the United States had been in Afghanistan, meddling in Afghanistan for 42 years. The US, as you pointed out first, it was the US that organized the Mujahideen against the progressive Afghan government in 1978 and onward. The US, in fact, was in a way instrumental in organizing the Al-Qaeda. The US was instrumental in bringing Osama bin Laden from the Sudan to Afghanistan to then recruit Al-Qaeda people from all over the world. So the US involvement in Afghanistan against the subversion of a progressive government in Afghanistan goes back to 1978 and continues to this very moment. And I would say this is not the first time, given American capitalism, given imperialism, given the neo-colonialism, the United States has been at war on smaller countries before that. It will be after this too. And we should remind our audience, that right now, there is a war being waged by 7 or 8 countries, which all happen to be Muslim countries. So it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and not to mention, for example, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Colombia, and other places. So it's the nature of the political economy that requires that the most powerful capitalist societies, reach out throughout the world, so to speak. It's the United States that has 750 different bases throughout the world. Again, as I said, the international political economy requires that the strong stays stronger, the wealthy stays wealthier, and that the dominant countries steal the resources, plunder and pillage, and steal the resources and markets and labor of the developing countries. In other words, the United States will not allow competitors, potential or real ones, to sort of challenge U.S. hegemony and U.S. quote vulgar economic interests anywhere on the planet. So Afghanistan will not be the last war. This is one in a series. There will be many more. And if it's not poor countries, it's going to be China, Russia, Iran.
Tara Curry, you're recognized to ask your question.
Thank you, Sally. Again, thank you, Dr. Wahab, very much for speaking tonight and for sharing your information. If I understood you correctly before, you said that the U.S. should recognize the Taliban, but of course with conditions. And I was wondering what conditions you had in mind.
Actually, there's a lot happening in that part of the world, Tammy. For example, Afghanistan's neighbors, immediate 6 neighbors, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Iran, these countries have been meeting almost nonstop to map out a sort of a position vis-a-vis Afghanistan, and the European Union is on record. Other countries are on record. All of them are saying that the Taliban are a fact of life, so to speak. You have to deal with them, whether you're delivering aspirin or food or whatever. You have to go through Taliban, and it makes sense to sort of deal with them and therefore recognize them. But also they would say we put conditions, and the conditions would of course be that the Taliban behave like a normal government that we expect throughout the world, and that is respect for human rights, respect for human freedoms, respect for women and girls, amnesty, no reprisals, and no revenge, and protecting, again, human rights altogether. These are the conditions that other countries and its neighbors have been voicing repeatedly, saying, this is what we expect you to do. We expect you to, uphold international norms and standards of conduct. And the Taliban sort of go back and forth. I will have to say, that the Taliban, again, I think one thing is that the Taliban were not really prepared to take over power. We all know that on August 16th, when the previous government, Ashraf Ghani, our man, the thief, and his clique escaped without telling in broad daylight with truckloads of cash, American dollars, cash escaped. There was no government in Kabul. And then former President Karzai and Mr. Abdullah and Mr. Hikmatyar, the three previous politicians, invited the Taliban saying, there's no government in Kabul. We want you to enter Kabul so you can bring law and order. So I think the Taliban are surprised themselves by inheriting the country that quickly, although they say they were not ready. So I think they don't know how to govern, for one thing, but also we now know that the Taliban are not sort of a homogeneous group, but there are also different sections amongst the Taliban. Some of them are more progressive than others, and there are obviously disagreements, including, for example, the replacement of Dr. Mohammad Usman Raburi, PhD from Germany, the chancellor of Kabul University, with a student who graduated 3 or 4 years ago with a BA, a very mediocre student who now is the chancellor of university. So Afghanistan, the Taliban are trying to figure out, how to sort of manage the country. And I think the world should put conditions, but also support the people. I think our concern now should be the vast majority of Afghans who are hungry this very moment as we speak. They don't even have safe drinking water. There's no electricity, no food, no medicine, no nothing. That's what we should be concerned with.
Eileen?
I agree, just as a quick follow-up, yes. My question wasn't so much about recognizing the Taliban, which I think should be obvious to any reasonable person, but what the conditions were. And some of the conditions you mentioned might be applied to Saudi Arabia also.
Well, yes, because I have lived in the Arab world. I went to school in Lebanon. So for one thing, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are directly implicated in the misery and suffering of Afghanistan. Both of these countries, along with the CIA, in the 1978, it was Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the US who intervened massively through the Mujahideen in 1978 and haven't stopped intervening to this moment. We know the conditions in Saudi Arabia of women, of human rights, of press freedom, human rights, et cetera, and we know the conditions in Pakistan too. So I think, yes, they should clean their own houses too, or the US should be consistent in expecting all countries in the world to uphold decent international norms.
I think we're going to allow only 2 more questions because we need time for other people. And please, no back and forth, or because it's not fair to other people. because we do have
Sure.
limited
Thank you.
time.
I'm sorry. I'll shut up right away.
No, not
You did
you.
great.
I mean, people can't follow up on their questions because it's not fair to the other people. Jennifer?
Yes, I wanted to ask about how the existence of two nuclear states in that region affects what's going on inside of Afghanistan's borders. Particularly, I'm talking about Pakistan and Israel.
Well, yes, in Iran being on the verge, perhaps we have known this for years that Israel holds nuclear weapons, but also its conventional weapons. We know the situation. I have been to Palestine and Israel myself. So I know the conditions. And I think when it comes to human rights, basic freedoms, etc., that question should be asked of Israel as well. But as Chomsky would point out, we're on the threshold of a major catastrophe. If it's not environmental, if it's not COVID, if it's not droughts, if it's not forest fires, it's the threat of nuclear war, and perhaps in that part of the world.
Yeah. Eileen?
Yes, thank you, Dave. Dr. Wahab, you talked about the United States making monetary reparations to the Afghan people and also about reserve funds being released. What guarantee is there that that money would get to the people?
Well, as I suggested, I really think that we need a UN peace and development force, because Afghanistan is a very complicated country. Even if all the foreigners were to be out in every way, there are indigenous conditions, in Afghanistan that can easily sort of trigger several civil wars, micro wars, ethnic, linguistic, regional, religious. Afghanistan is a very heterogeneous, diverse society. It's conflict-ridden. There are enormous disparities. There's corruption. There's a tradition of violence. As I said, the country is, most of the women and men still live in the 17th century. It's a very poor country. It's underdeveloped, and it's very uneducated people. Only 15% of the women are illiterate. Literate at this point. 75% of the people are illiterate. So we need a UN peacekeeping force from neutral countries that would sort of maintain stability, law and order, keep the people away from each other, but also don't give a penny to any Afghan government, I would say, or NGOs. Give it to a credible, clean, screened UN peacekeeping force. Establish a trust fund. So all the money should go to a trust fund and be managed by, credible, decent civil servant, international civil servants. If you give money to you have to give some money to the government, but I think that should also be monitored and supervised. But you also have to, I say, mentor the Afghan, the Taliban or whoever might be in charge, because these people are not ready to govern.
Thank you.
Now we'll have Mortaza Deleri speak.
Thank
He's
you
a
very
former, thank you.
Thank
He's
you
a
very much, all. Thank you, everybody.
He's a former Afghan advisor to the US military who has been in Afghanistan and is now in Washington, DC.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing such an event. As Dr. Zahar talked about, like right now, pretty much after a month, the entire world is almost going silent, and it's unfortunate. And the people of Afghanistan is being forgetting it one more time by the world community as a whole. But if we start how all this catastrophe started, it goes all the way back to when the United States indirectly supported Mujahideen, when Mujahideen was created to topple Dr. Najibullah's regime, and before even the rise of the Taliban. When the communist regime under the Dr. Najibullah was overthrown by the Mujahideen in 1990s, then the United States left Afghanistan and its people to its own cause. And unfortunately, that led to a bloody civil war for 4 years, and the Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, was destroyed to the ground. And people suffered a major catastrophe by that violence that caused the different ethnic groups. They fought each other in Kabul to who's going to run who's going to get more power. And then after that's from 1990 to 1995 to the beginning of 1996, these groups, they fought each other, and then the Taliban was created, and Taliban took over, and they had, of course, major support from the Saudi government and Pakistani government, and they're having that support till this day, and that support has continued directly or indirectly, unfortunately. And the world has seen it but never condemned it, and the world never stopped Pakistan to do not interfere into Afghanistan's internal affairs. And that interference continued till this very day. And the US invasion, of course, we all know that how it led to Afghanistan's invasion of Afghanistan. As Dr. Zahir mentioned, it was necessarily not Afghans. It was orchestrated by the Arabs and those that they attacked America, or the World Tower, was Saudi citizens. But of course, after US invaded Afghanistan, that's when I grew up under the Taliban. And of course, the Taliban were never welcomed by the people. And like today, they're not being welcomed by the people again. And they will never be able to win the hearts and minds of the people because they are not who the Afghans expect them to be. And the invasion of United States, of course, toppled the Taliban, and the people, the regular, ordinary people, that because they were tired of the totalitarian regime, that people had no voice, a woman had no rights, and people were to the point that they had just a dark age, living with uncertainty, with an uncertain future. When the United States installed a government, a democratic government, which basically did not started with the nation building. The United States went inside Afghanistan and got rid of Taliban, and then accomplished its mission to basically get rid of Al Qaeda. But when the Taliban was defeated, in my personal belief, it should have been defeated in a manner that they should have been annihilated totally, so they would have never been able to make a comeback. And unfortunately, on the other hand, when United States went inside Afghanistan, it did not have a very strategic exit policy, that if we're going in, how we're going to get out. And also, there was no notion of nation building. All these things unfold over time. What we need to do to have a government, if we leave, so they can sustain. So with the Al Qaeda or all the other international terrorist organizations will not have a safe haven again in Afghanistan to attack the rest of the world. But unfortunately, over time, there was always this confusion exactly why we are here and what are our goals. And at the same time, this notion of nation building a government that could sustain itself, while the United States spent treasure there, $2 trillion, but it went to mostly to warlords, to the people that they were already had the hands of bloods of Afghans in their hands, and the rich got richer, and there was no sense of accountability. And the governments that they were running the show, the government that they were democratic on the surface, on facade, but they were never been democratic. They were never held accountable. The corruption was like to the highest, And we had so many times all these, like exact reports that the corruption is like, well, this government will not last if United States leave Afghanistan. But unfortunately, while we had all these evidence that the government will not last because of its corruption and it cannot sustain itself. But at the same time, United States, while the people at the beginning of 2009 welcomed the United States and supported its nation to get rid of terrorists and its allies, but unfortunately, the United States did the same thing again to people of Afghanistan. And my point is exactly the Afghans, not the government, not any government, just the people, because we're talking about 35 to 36 million people that they are currently living under severe poverty and uncertain future again. And the United States did not have any program, and they knew that the government will not be able to sustain itself because of all those reasons that I talked about. But still, they decided to leave with a haste and without anything in place in order to make sure that while we're going, the government or the system that we're going to build will sustain itself. But that didn't happen. While treasures were wasted, lives were taken, but unfortunately, at the same time, there was no sense of how we're going to keep a government running, and it's not going to fall again to the hands of terrorists and to the hands of those that will just not obey any international norms, and they're not bound to any international norms. But unfortunately, that happened again, and the United States just exited, and it created a chaos. And we have seen all these situations that has been coming from Kabul and throughout Afghanistan. And today, not only the United States, the entire world, the international community owes a lot to Afghans, because Afghans were never part of all these decisions. It was the installed government that they were basically imposed on people, and the elections were all fraudulent and they were never won by elections. So basically the government never represented these governments that they governed in the past 20 years or in the past 2 decades. They never represented the people of Afghanistan. They never represent the will of the Afghan population. And unfortunately, we left, again, people to its own cause, to the most brutal regime again, that they have no mercy, nothing so that people can, and now I'm in constant contact with people that they are in Kabul. People are living in fear. People are living in hideouts. People are, they're all developing some type of psychological issues because of all of a sudden, the regime that the people hated the most are making a comeback, well, at no time. And what we can do right now as United States and the international community, while we should never let a terror enterprise to become the legitimate government of Afghanistan, because I do not necessarily agree that I do not at any time will agree to legitimize a terror enterprise as a government of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan do not have a government right now, and the people are left on their own. So the United States, what can do is to help the people of Afghanistan. It can leverage on influences that has in countries like Pakistan, the Gulf states, and get the help through international organizations to the people of Afghanistan, not through the Taliban, because if it gets to their hand, it will never get to the real people. These people are as corrupt as previous government. It will not get to the people that will never reach the people that they need the help. And of course, the people that they have been displaced from their homes and internally, they are all over Afghanistan, and they're all living and without knowing what the future holds for them and where to go, where to seek refuge. All the countries, the neighboring countries, they have they have blocked their borders, and they're not letting Afghans to pass the borders. And the Afghans, at the very first day of the collapse, those that they could make it to the airport, they knew that all of them will not be able to be evacuated. Most of them, they went to Pakistani border, Iranian border, and they were swarmed. But unfortunately, those countries, they totally blocked their borders, and nobody's allowed to pass the borders. And right now, unfortunately, as people are suffering, and that suffering continues every day, the poverty and the insecurity. And while that is happening, the world is just starting to just observe, and they're not taking any practical action to help the regular people, the ordinary people. I'm not necessarily talking about the government. And whatever we can do right now to help the people, the refugees, and those that they're being displaced by the war, they should get whatever support we can get to them through international organizations, through NGOs, through United Nations, somehow to get the help. And also at the same time, we have left allies behind, like people like myself who helped US mission in Afghanistan. We even, unfortunately, even when we evacuated this 122,000 people, we left people that they were qualified to be evacuated because they supported United Nations, America's mission in Afghanistan. Most of those people were left behind. We evacuated people that they were not eligible at any under no circumstance to be evacuated. We left people that they were eligible behind, and we evacuated people that they were not eligible. And also, we should make sure to find ways to, America can use its influence on Gulf states, Pakistan, to get those that they will never be safe in Afghanistan, to get them out of Afghanistan till in the future, if there's going to be a regime that will assure their safety. But right now, a lot of people like myself are not safe in Afghanistan, and they will never be safe under the Taliban. And as far as women's rights, the Taliban, they promised that they will respect women's rights. But as we are seeing their actions, they are doing the same thing that they did in 19. They're barring them from school. They're not letting them to work in government or work outside their homes. And they believe that women are just belongs to home, and they just need to stay inside, and they're not allowed to have any other activity besides just being a mother and staying home. And they're not even allowed to go outside of their homes without a male accompanying them. So the woman's rights is completely violated again, as the rest of the rights of the people. But women's rights is right now in total dismay, and the women are totally, of course, they're nowhere to be happy with this regime, and they will never be happy. And under no circumstances, the people already, the woman, especially the woman, that the very first days of the Taliban, even if they knew that the Taliban are, they're a brutal force and they can be killed, they can be, detained, but they defied Taliban rules. They showed up to the streets of Kabul and the rest of the part of the country. Then they defied the rule and they asked for their rights. But unfortunately, whatever the Taliban at the beginning, when they promised that they will, all those promises that they made, they did not commit to none of those. And the Afghans are not ready to be governed by the Taliban under no circumstances, under no conditions, because they already have that experience with the Taliban from 1996 to 2001. And they are not ready under no situation to be ruled by a total totalitarian regime. So that being said, what we can do is, as what the world can do is to make sure, while there's no government there and the people are not safe, at least to ensure their safety. The people are to make sure to leverage on those that they have leveraged on Taliban to at least protect people, minorities, and women and girls at the same time. And at the same time, we need to send as much as humanitarian aid as possible. As there are videos surfacing on social media every day on Afghan social platform that poverty is like to the extremist. And that is what we can do right now. But unfortunately, we left people and nation behind on their own now to the hands of the most brutal regime on earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murtaza. We're going to have the next two speakers in the short video before we get questions, and then we'll have questions for everyone. Want to introduce Kathleen Foster. She's a New York-based documentary filmmaker. We're going to share some clips from her video from her film called Afghan Women, A History of Struggle. At the end, we'll be able to give you a link to a place where you can see the whole movie. She has made videos since the 1980s, combining elements of history, current events, with a focus on grassroots struggles for change. Kathleen?
I'm here. Can you hear me? Oh,
Yes.
okay. So I just want to briefly say that I was in Afghanistan in the mid-1970s. I was a photojournalist, and I went there 2 or 3 times. And it was a time of peace. It was a very peaceful time, and it wasn't, it was a poor country, but there was no real horror, no starvation. People lived. There were problems, but nothing like like neighboring Pakistan or India or anything like that. But excuse me, at the same time, there was a growing movement for social change. There were people who called themselves communists. There were people who called themselves socialists. There were Democrats, and it was spreading throughout the industry and throughout the rural areas, because most people live in the rural areas of Afghanistan. And the largest political party, the PDPA, took power in 1978, and it was women joined the party in droves. They were one of the major departments of the government was run by a woman, and so on and so forth. At the same time, and I think other people have mentioned all of this also, so I won't go into it too much, but at the same time, the US was training and funding and recruiting for a jihad of Muslims, fundamentalists throughout the world, from Afghanistan and surrounding countries, to invade Afghanistan, to fight a jihad, a holy war against the communists in Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. And that was 78. I didn't go back again until a year after the US had invaded. And at that time, I met with, the Taliban had gone more or less, but not really. And I met with women who had been activists in that movement in the 70s. And there was a feeling of, people were not happy that the US were there, but there was a feeling that there was a chance that they could start again, talking about rebuilding their country as they wanted it, a more egalitarian society and equality for women. So this documentary was made in 2007, I think. That you're going to see clips from it at that point. Hello?
Yep.
Okay, I think that's it. I'm just saying the.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Sorry, I've got a sore throat. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see, where's my screen? Sorry. Somebody else shared their screen?
I don't think
didn't.
so. I don't think so. Let's see. You should be able to share. But don't forget
We'll
to,
stop the other screen sharing. Okay. There we go.
and don't forget to
Yeah.
check the boxes.
The mothers and daughters of Afghanistan were captives in their own homes, forbidden from working or going to school. Today, women are free.
If you go and talk to women in Afghanistan and you say, do you feel liberated? I would guarantee you that over 80% would say, no, I don't feel liberated.
They went to Afghanistan and they put the same people who the people of Afghanistan called them terrorists. They put those people back in power. It's like replacing one set of terrorists with another set of terrorists in Afghanistan. And then we call that the liberation of women of Afghanistan. The rape and abduction, the forced marriages are still there. Women are in jail just because they run away from their abusive husbands.
Women are just cooking oil on themselves. They burn themselves because they are so desperate that they don't see any more hope. They don't see any future for themselves.
A woman was dying right in front of my eyes. And that was the third woman in 2 weeks who was dying from burns.
Most people find it hard to believe that Afghan women essentially had equality under the Constitution of 1964.
The US was not prepared to send its troops to fight what it perceived to be Soviet aggression. So the US asked Pakistan to become its frontline ally against the Soviet Union in that region. US aid through the CIA to the Pakistani army and the Pakistani ISI, their intelligence services, started to occur. That military aid was then channeled to what came to be known as the Mujahideen forces in Afghanistan.
They gave them more weapons, they gave them more supplies, money, and Tora Bora.
They were being trained both in the use of military equipment and they were being trained in ideology, going to go fight the jihad, give up your life for the jihad.
They created these religious fanatics because they thought that the only thing that they can use against the Russian and defeat the Russian in countries like Afghanistan would be religion.
The official version, right, is that we started supplying aid to the, quote, rebels after the Soviets invaded in December of '79. In fact, Carter's regime started supplying the so-called rebels much prior. By July '79, the covert aid had already started.
President Reagan did the most damage there, actually.
I'm going to repeat how honored I am by these visitors that we have with us, 6 from the Afghanistan freedom fighters. The young lady underwent.
These same fundamentalist factions whose followers were responsible for throwing acid on women's faces, right? Way back when, at the beginning of the '70s. We were helping them because we felt it was in our geopolitical interests to get the Soviets in there, to then, bog them down in what did end up to be a 10-year war for them. Afghanistan became part of the great game between the US and the USSR in order to control the resources and, of course, oil and natural gas located right there in that region. Brzezinski's book talks about it.
the Soviet Union must pay a concrete price for their aggression.
From 79 to 89, Afghanistan was at war. The war was not of Afghan against Russian. The war was the war of American and Russian, but with the blood of Afghan people. It was a war fought mostly in the rural areas. On one side was the army of the Afghan government in the Soviet Union. And on the other side was the Mujahideen or Jihadis, backed by the US government.
Every day, the Mujahideen was getting stronger, getting more weapons.
چې د اوله سر چې مجاهد په شهر کې نه و راغلی تر غونډۍ غورځوله اوانونه غورځوله دغه شهیدان به کېدله په د زموږ کوڅه د شاوخوا د خان ریاست چې دی شالنه وکړي میان غچان برانګرده به شهیدان کېدل چې په همسایګان شهیدان په خربارو 18 نفر زموږ په دوستان کې شهیدان.
They would burn villages, burn crops, spill acid on women's face, rape women. One way or the other, force the villagers to get out of their village. The international community gave money to help the millions and millions of refugees who came from Afghanistan and filling up the refugee camps in Pakistan. And that money was channeled through the fundamentalist leaders, through the warlords, and they pocketed much of the money. In addition, they forced many of the refugees, especially the young men, to join their militia and fight the jihad.
We're only a few years removed from the rule of terrorists, when women were denied education and every basic human right. That tyranny has been replaced by young democracy, and the power of freedom is on display across Afghanistan.
That kind of hypocrisy is just mind-boggling. When we say we're going in there to defend the rights of Afghan women, we in fact have helped to create the conditions and aid and abet those same people who trample on human rights, who trample on women's rights, who trample on minority rights. And it's all for what? For domination of the world's resources and for domination, pure and simple.
The common people do not trust America. They've only seen America aligning with warlords, with commanders, with people who were the enemies and are the enemies of the Afghan people. Warlords have built homes that are worth millions of dollars. There's been enough proof that they are being channeled with money from sources connected with America.
The US presence in Afghanistan has two benefits for the US. One is China, which is getting stronger and stronger, and they're afraid that China would be another superpower. And another is the oil in the region, the oil in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, in that area.
They have virtually unfettered access to Persian Gulf. Now it has established military bases there. It's a power game to keep the same people in power, to keep the riches and the oil wealth and so on concentrated in the same hands. It all becomes part of this great game, which is ultimately one of keeping the status quo the same the world over. So women's oppression becomes part of this great game until we learn to deal with power differently and to really want to redistribute that power. I think this game will continue and women will always be the victims, and the issues of their rights or lack thereof will always end up being used in this way.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Our last speaker is going to be Brittany Ramos DeBarros. She was deployed to Afghanistan for a year in 2012, and she's worked on economic and racial liberation issues in various capacities since she returned. She lives in Staten Island and is currently a candidate for Congress running against Nicole Militakis, which we're grateful for. Brittany? Are you there? I thought I saw you.
She just went
Yes,
out.
I'm here. I'm just pulling it up on my computer, so it's a little easier to see everyone. Okay.
Recording in progress.
Can you hear me okay now? Sorry about that.
Can you start your video, Brittany, so we can spotlight you?
I'm here.
Okay.
Can you see me?
Yes.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I can just give a little introduction about my experience, and then I'd love to make sure that there's time for questions if anyone wants to ask questions, because I know that there are rightfully a lot of questions about what is happening and what has happened with our war on Afghanistan. And so, for me, I grew up in a working class family, a conservative military family. And what I'm grateful for is that my parents really instilled in me this love for the values that we're told that America is supposed to be about, right? Justice, opportunity, and these other ideas. And yet I'm also biracial. And from the very beginning, I could look around with my own eyes and see that the America that my white family was living in was just not the same as the America that my Black Puerto Rican family was living in. But regardless, we struggled to keep food on the table and a roof over our head. And all in all, I ended up going to college on an Army scholarship. And I have to say that when I went to college, my worldview started to expand. I started to really learn about, different perspectives and really start to make sense of the systems that I had viscerally experienced for a lot of my life. But when I graduated in 2011 and commissioned as an Army officer, I was a platoon leader responsible for 40 lives and already had deployment orders for Afghanistan in hand. And I ended up deploying in 2012, and my orders were to support transition operations in preparation for withdrawal. Because, I'm not sure what has already been discussed, but if, many of you don't recall, the Obama-Biden administration promised that we would be leaving Afghanistan by 2014, no matter what. And if you haven't, you can go back and watch that, vice presidential debate with Biden and Paul Ryan, and he swears that, these other guys, they have conditions, not us. No conditions. We leave Afghanistan by 2014, no matter what. And right now we're deploying people to make sure that we leave well, right? And that we do right by the Afghan people and that we leave them equipped to be able to protect themselves and protect democracy. So I went really believing that. And a lot of the clips in the video that we just watched, Laura Bush talking about us going to save the Afghan women. Those were all things that really shaped my beliefs. And when I actually deployed, I can say it feels painfully naive to say in hindsight, but I was a true believer then. I really thought I was going to help protect the Afghan people from the bad guys, and fight for freedom and democracy. And that felt like a just reason to be willing to potentially do violence, to potentially die, right? To spread these beautiful values that I was raised in, and make sure that everyone had access to those things. And yet when I got there, it was devastating. It was devastating to see with my own eyes that we were so obviously doing so much more harm than good to the Afghan people. And the more time that I spent with Afghan families, which was a lot of time during my deployment, the more I lived a moral contradiction. And, at the time I would have arguments with commanders who would say things in meetings like, okay, tomorrow we're going to go raid this village tomorrow night. And I would say, why? That has nothing to do with our mission. We're supposed to be training the Afghan National Army. We're supposed to be building up, a facility so that we can move the then decades worth of equipment that had accumulated in the country. And people would say, well, because they're not cooperating. And, our mission is still to like keep things safe. And I was like, okay, but they're not cooperating because they're terrified, rightly, that we are leaving. And if they work with us, that it could cost them their entire family. It could cost them, their crops could be burned, all of these things, right? They're not just not cooperating with us for no reason, and certainly not reasons that raiding their village would improve. And I just found myself over and over again, this like bright-eyed true believer fighting with my own chains of command about the mission that we all had the same mission on paper for. And it just became clearer and clearer, and when I put that together with the rampant, lack of accountability and sometimes outright corruption that I was also seeing in, our command climate. And then I also saw the way that corporations seem to be running the show. For example, I was in an Army engineer battalion, and I had a maintenance platoon. I was a maintenance platoon leader when I first deployed. And there was a time where our MRAPs, right, our mine resistant vehicles had broken down. And we had an entire platoon of mechanics that knew how to fix it, had everything that they needed to fix it, but were legally not allowed to fix the vehicles to continue with the mission because there was a corporate stipulation in the contract with the manufacturer that said that only the corporate mechanics could work on the vehicles. And so we sat there sitting ducks for a week, waiting for corporate mechanics to fly across the country to come render our, the platoon that needed the vehicles fixed mission capable again. And so, when you see things like that and you start talking to these contractors that have been hanging out there for years, are making hundreds of $1,000s a year, while active duty families that are on food stamps, right, that are still, even with an active duty, job and the benefits that are significantly better than many jobs in our economy, right, that they're still struggling to just make basic ends meet because a private first class still makes so little in the big scheme, especially if they have a family. And so when you put all of those things together, I came home angry and hurt and with this really confused sense of betrayal, that I knew that I felt betrayed, that I felt used, that I felt like, what was all this violence for? What could we possibly be accomplishing with all of that, what I just saw? But also, I still, even at that time, hadn't really made sense of the systems that were at play. I didn't know a lot of the history back then that is in that video, and I'm sure has been discussed earlier in the meeting. And I think that I set out, I had this unfulfilled hunger to still serve, I think, because I felt like, you're told you're going to go serve your country. And that's, I think one of the most heartbreaking things is you come back and you say, what have I actually done for the people that are living all around me, struggling to just get by to? And how has that been a service to families that need housing and healthcare and basic things, even here, right? And so it took me a long time to kind of make sense of those systems and really learn, but I got involved in economic and racial justice work, and that led me on a path to making sense of the way that political dynamics and the corporate influence on political decisions had played such a role in someone like me being sent to kill and die, essentially to help the bottom line or the political career of many of these people. And so, that's a little bit about my experience. I want to stop there. I guess I'll just end that. I also, this withdrawal, it needed to happen. There was no, I don't think occupying the country it wasn't a matter of time, right? That we needed more time. I think that I'm grateful that the Biden administration finally upheld the promise to withdraw. And I can't understand how anyone can look at the nature of how this withdrawal happened and believe that we ever had any real regard for the lives and wellness of Afghan people. And I think that that's a real shame. I think that there needs to be real accountability for the corruption and lies that led to devastating violence and harm, and has harmed the US military community, veterans, Afghan people, and people all over the world, and communities across our country here as well. So I think for me, if I'm thinking about where do we go from here, withdrawal is not enough. We have to end the so-called global war on terror. It has been wildly counterproductive by our own State Department's measures. It has increased terrorist recruitment and activity in every place that we have bombed or occupied as a part of that war. And I think that if we truly want to be safe, that we have to be willing to confront that truth and invest in things that we know actually can have an impact on, breaking the cycles of violence and cultivating safety for all of us.
We're now gonna have time for questions. So I think raising your hand really worked well. And I also want to thank Brittany, because she gave a very impassioned and insightful picture of what the contradictions were that the soldiers in Afghanistan faced. And that's a very important perspective. So I want to thank her so much. And do we have any questions?
No.
No?
Okay, no questions? Okay, as a moderator, can I make a statement? I guess so. The one thing, I liked what Dr. Wahab said. The one thing that really bothered me was the call for UN peace troops. We have friends in Haiti. They are an occupying army. They brought cholera there. They did nothing to get rid of it, the UN. They never had cholera. And it was proven that it was brought. We don't even know about this here by the UN. They have not done anything but support whatever the US supported government is. So UN troops are just as much part of the problem as everything else. Any questions? Ghanim?
Ghanim, unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, it wouldn't unmute for me. First of all, I want to thank everybody for having an event like this. These issues are very important to analyze and explain. I think this event was it was in the right direction. However, I have to say, being in the peace movement for almost 20 years and analyzing specifically Muslim-Western relations and the understanding between peoples, the Muslim world and Europe and North America, I'm a little bit disappointed that the speakers before Brittany, there was so much Eurocentric strands within how Afghanistan and the Afghani people and their culture and their history and the political movements are described, how they're analyzed. This issue is still plagued by Eurocentric narratives. I call it Westocentric now because a lot of American scholars do the same thing. A lot of you are familiar with Orientalism and how that distorts or creates the West as a standard that, the rest of the world should follow. And I sort of like, when I was listening to what some of the speakers were saying, they sort of fell into that category where they're using Eurocentric narratives to judge a people who ought to speak for themselves. For example, like we're speaking a lot about fundamentalism and freedom and rights, but those are categories that are specifically in a dominant way defined by the West. So they're defined by the West, and everybody else has to follow those definitions. which is absurd. Edward Said, the author of Orientalism, called it an absurdity, and many other people do also. So that's the only thing that I would say that I found, flawed in this event is that we still need to analyze these issues without the Eurocentric bias. And if we could do that, then we would probably have a better, more accurate understanding of the people there and of the region there, and what role Islam plays. And these terms like fundamentalist and stuff like that, these are terms Western scholars, Orientalists, came up with to categorize and divide Muslim groups from each other, to create the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy, which they use to control people. And it's happened in Central America, South America. It's happened in Australia with the Aborigine population. It's happened in Africa and other parts of the world where Orientalists, this is the way they analyze it. So, because it makes imperialism easier to deploy the narratives of imperialism. So, but that's the only thing I wanted to say. But it shouldn't be a sad thing. I think this is an event that's a step in the right direction.
Neil's up next, Dave.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this evening's presentations by everybody. I wanted to thank especially Brittany. It seemed like such a heartfelt statement that you made. And I think I put in the chat that I think it mirrors the experience that a lot of young people went through in terms of their deployments, whether it was to Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, and it's where they went with intentions they thought were correct and came back disillusioned by their experience. And I put in the chat that during the that period, somebody sold me a T-shirt and it said, "Send Jenna and Barbara." So if you remember who they were, the daughters who didn't go, right? You're the daughter that did go. So I think that the rich fight wars to the last drop of our blood, and we should bear that in mind. And we should spread the notion that we shouldn't fight their wars. That's all. Thank you.
Nobody else? Go to another page.
No, they appear automatically on the first page.
Oh.
Can I make a?
Sure.
Can I speak? I wonder. I hope this isn't out of line. It's nothing. It's not exactly what we're talking about. But one of the women in the film, Fahima, the film that you've just seen, has been working for maybe 2 decades. She lives here in the US, but she's been working for 2 decades, building schools, building wells for girls, women, and young boys, and so on and so forth. She's a very small NGO in Afghanistan, and she is currently working night and day, getting people's papers, lawyers, trying to find funds for the people who are being, who are either stuck in Kabul or stuck in different places around the world. So if anybody wants to give any, could I make a pitch for funding Afghan Women's Fund? It's called. It's very simple, and she has a website, Afghan Women's Fund.
I'll send the link.
Thank you.
Okay, I put the link in here and we'll put it up on send it out on an email too. Because it's always good to find
individuals,
good small NGOs.
Yeah,
I
she
remember.
does amazing.
I'm sorry.
I'm saying she does amazing things. I've been around various places with her in Afghanistan, visiting little villages that have a well, which is or it's a school or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, the last time in Haiti we gave to, unfortunately, Wyclef Jean, who took, the money didn't get to people. So I think we have to be more careful.
This definitely will. She just called, actually, as we were all told.
Great.
Nobody else?
Nobody else?
Okay, I'd like to say one other thing then. My experience has been that Afghan women and Afghan men, but I know more about Afghan women, are really fighters. They have been for a long time. There was a very strong social movement in the 60s and the 70s with really very radical ideas of changing society. And a lot of women joined those organizations. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of RAWA, Revolutionary Women of Afghanistan. So I don't exactly feel optimistic, because who can feel optimistic in this world? But I do think that's one thing that we should concentrate on, and we should find out more about, like, who is actually organizing in Afghanistan, which I just feel that you do see demonstrations of women on the streets, which is an indication of women are not just going to sit around and let this go on. And it's been my experience that Afghans have been awakened in the last 40, 50 years, 60 years. Maybe he left, right?
Yeah, Dr.
Yeah, the doctor had another Zoom, unfortunately.
We would know more about that than me.
Dave, can I ask a question?
Sure.
What was interesting with our speakers, the first two, and I would be interested in Murtaza and Brittany responding, and Ghanem, if you're willing to, is there was definitely a difference in respect to the Taliban in terms of, in one side, Dr. Wahab was saying that it's important to recognize them and no sanctions against the government or the people. And whereas I felt Murtaza was on the opposite side, which I think is the same kinds of tension that we are going to see, played out in the next few months in the US government and, around the world perhaps. So I just would, and Brittany, you didn't hear Dr. Wahab, but he, there was definitely a difference of opinion that maybe we should tease out a little bit, because I think that's what we're going to be confronting in the next few months as a peace organization, that tension.
Can I counter that? I don't know what the gentleman's name was. Can I talk about what he basically referred to? I did not amplify any Western. I did not amplify any Western ideology, and I did not touch up on religious fundamentalists, and I did not refer to anybody as a religious fundamentalist. But if we are going to talk about the truth, that is, let's face it, the way that we are seeing what was exactly going in Afghanistan, because a lot of people from the Muslim world, unfortunately, when it comes to criticizing, they do criticize. When it comes to problem, but they're not ever to stand up for the rights of the people as a groups, as a Muslim world. But when it comes to criticizing, it's very easy to criticize based on Islamic values. But I did not mention anything that I did not mention any group as a fundamentalist, but but because I'm from Afghanistan and I grew up in Afghanistan, I do know that Taliban is a fundamentalist group and they're directly being influenced by Wahhabism ideology, and they do not represent that ideology in Afghanistan. Even Afghanistan, a Muslim country, but the Afghans mostly they practice Hanafi school of practice. But I did not refer to necessarily anything that amplify Western rhetorics or Western narratives.
Yeah.
I just spoke the truth, what is exactly happening in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And we're seeing all that right now in practice. Like people are defying Taliban and they don't want that government. And also there's, of course, even that when the Taliban was in power in 1996 to 2001, there was a Northern Alliance resisting them. Even they had the Pakistani support and the Saudi support. But today there's going to be another resistance as well. And that resistance was crushed by the Pakistani government, but it's not going anywhere. And that those people are making a comeback, and those people are wanted by the Afghan people. And if we say that Taliban took the victory through war, no, it did not happen through war. They were just handed the government through like whatever reason it was behind the deal. So they did not become victorious, because we had, if we really wanted to fight, there was a lot of Afghan soldiers that they were willing to fight, but no, their weapons were taken away from them, and they were crying that, "Oh, you're taking my weapon away from me. I'm willing to fight. I will not give up my weapon to a terrorist organization." So that is the reality. And unfortunately, yes, we destroy the nation by the name of religion, when religion plays just a name, but cannot do anything for people. And Afghans are a majority, they are Muslim, but the Muslim world has nothing, they have never done anything for Afghans besides just harming them. And that's the truth.
Yeah.
That was very good, Mortaza.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you see, and this is not just in Afghanistan, that this was the US imperialist government's way to defeat and to make themselves powerful by pushing these groups. And it's not all Muslims, it's not all of Islam, but there is that fundamentalist group. There's the same group in the United States that is abolishing, abortions right now, that is taken over, that
we have our own
Trump, we have our own Taliban, Trump-a-ban, somebody called it. I saw a cartoon. It's the same thing. It had a cartoon a while ago, but it's that type of thing, which also oppresses women.
We have two people on stack, Laneem and Amnea.
Amnea and then Ghanim.
I think that question was also partially directed to me. So just to weigh in, I think it's not for me to comment on, the cultural dynamics and lived truth of Afghan people right now, right? I think that the US has done enough harm, and it has not, mostly been for the better. And I would be remiss, I'm not sure if this came up before, but I was a psychological operations officer, which is nice speak for psychological warfare. And what I know that often gets left out of the narrative is not just that Pakistan played also an imperialist role alongside the United States and other nations, that the United States recruited Pakistan into that role, funded the ISI, and that in many of the refugee camps that were created across Pakistan, Iran, etc., that the United States psychological operations special forces, right, distributed textbooks and propaganda that we had developed to promote a violent interpretation of jihad, right? We took the language of Islam and co-opted it, spun it up into something that we thought would serve our interests in leveraging Afghanistan as a proxy war, a ground for proxy war against the USSR with Pakistan. And we distributed those textbooks saying things and you can find, I did a whole I shared a Twitter thread that an Afghan historian wrote that was incredible on this topic. And there are, primary source photos of these textbooks that were distributed. And this generation of the Taliban, right, had grew up, many of them grew up in those refugee camps being propagandized by U.S. Special Forces propaganda that was intentionally meant to promote violence and a misdirection of what Islam actually is. And in many cases, there's a lot of documented evidence as well that, they said they created these, grotesque images of weapons, and they were supposedly to teach English, but they would say things like, when I love my country, I, take jihad against Russia. And in many of those cases, I'm paraphrasing, right? But these were English textbooks that we distributed as propaganda. And many of those cases, the Russia has been crossed out, right? And then that ideology has been promoted. And so I also think it's really important to understand that we literally planted the seeds of fundamentalism, if that's what we're calling it, right? And that we promoted this ideology very intentionally to serve our own ends in ways that are really, excuse my language, but really fucked up. Like I just don't know how else to say that. And I don't mean to offend anyone, but I think people need to really grasp that this is not, we're talking about millions and millions of people who have been impacted by the cycles of violence that were cultivated by that, that continue, right? And so that's one thing. And speaking on sanctions, I speak from a place of pragmatism and care for humans. And I think that if our care is for the humans living in Afghanistan, then sanctions against the government has just been ineffective against every oppressive government that we have tried to leverage them against. It has only hurt the civilian population and has not had an impact on those governments and the actions of those governments towards their own people or towards other nations. And in many cases, it has emboldened those governments because it gives them space to, further present themselves as saviors, right? As see, these other guys hate us and we are actually the good guys. And so I don't think that, from a sheer place of if we're doing that because we're concerned for Afghans, then no, we shouldn't. We should in fact be giving reparations and fueling the ability to invest in civil social infrastructure that can really build up, that can allow Afghans their own agency to build up their own communities again and improve things.
Naya.
Thank you. Brittany.
Thank you, Brittany. That was wonderful, by the way.
Yeah.
Hi guys, my thought is just really short and simple. I just want to respond to the claim that some of the speakers tonight have been Orientalists. I just really have to disagree. As a Muslim, as an Arab, I'm very familiar with Edward Said's Orientalism theories, and I don't think it's Orientalist to say that fundamentalism is fundamentalism, similar to what David was saying, about there are fundamentalists in Texas right now. That's what they are. There are fundamentalists in the Taliban and in the Wahhabi interpretations of Islam that a lot of the US government and the Saudi government has propagated. The repercussions of American imperialism and Saudi Wahhabist versions of Islam literally have repercussions in every single Muslim country. All of our countries have become more conservative over the course of 20, 30 years, religiously speaking, because of this ideology. Even if we're not in Afghanistan and we're not dealing with this kind of terrorism, these ideas are dangerous. They are fundamentalists, and I really find, as a Muslim woman, as a Muslim, it's so important for us to call these what they are. I don't think it's about good Muslim versus bad Muslim, but we're dealing literally with a force that is stopping women from going to school. What else should we call that? That is fundamentalist. And it's not even, I wouldn't even call it fundamentalist, because that has no basis in Islam in a huge way. So I understand the opposition to that term, because this isn't an extreme version of Islam. This just isn't Islam. There's nothing in our religion that says that we're supposed to stop women from going to school and stop them from going outside and but I do believe that we have to call this what it is. And I think it's really dangerous to say that we shouldn't criticize this. We should. Everybody should criticize this. Muslims should criticize this. Non-Muslims should criticize this. This is a worldwide problem that, again, like American imperialism created this fundamentalism, but that doesn't make it not fundamentalism. It still is. Yes, our religion was exploited for American imperialist goals. It really stinks that that happened, but it is fundamentalist. It is what it is. So yeah, that's just my comment. It's pretty short.
Ghanim?
All right, I was able to mute that time properly. All right, so I disagree. First, I want to respond to Murtaza. You stated that the Taliban should have been completely annihilated. After I'm done, I would like for you to elaborate on what full annihilation looks like. And to the other speaker, see, the pictures keep changing, so now I don't know who the other speaker was. I don't know your name. I don't want to mispronounce anybody's name. But the speaker who was just speaking, please define fundamentalism for me. From an anthropological point of view, there are several definitions of fundamentalism. From a sociological point of view, the definitions are different. From a theological point of view, the definitions, again, are different. So altogether, there's numerous definitions of what a fundamentalist is, equating what we identify as fundamentalism in the United States, what's happening in Texas recently, to foreign groups is hazardous because the definitions are fluid. People just use the term and they equate one group to another group, and they might not have anything to do with each other. So from an anthropological, from a theological point of view, the word fundamentalist is problematic. It generalizes. It hides the subtleties. It conceals the differences, the important vital differences in, which are important to analyze when you're analyzing groups of people. And also, there's too much monolithic descriptions here. Like when we talk about the Taliban, there's several different strands of Taliban, and they opposed each other. They continue to oppose each other for 20 years. But when we say Taliban, it's automatically reduced to simplistic understandings of the Taliban. And then you can get away with saying whatever you want to say, as long as, people agree with you, because they don't know what the differences are either of the different types of Taliban. So that's what I'm opposing. I'm not a supporter of the Taliban. I don't like the Taliban. It's half true that they're influenced by Wahhabism, but when you really analyze the way they explain the role of Islam, they admit that it's not Islam. They themselves say these are cultural practices. They call it urf, the cultural practices. And we're trying to mix it up with the Islam. Some of it's Hanafi, some of the Taliban beliefs are Hanafi, and some of them are Wahhabi. Yes, this is true. But it's so much complicated than how we're describing them. We're describing them too monolithically. And that's the objections that I have.
Well, I want to say that I posted in the chat, if somebody wants to send me an email, I'll send it to them, where you can see Afghan women, the full film. It's definitely worth watching. It's a history of struggle, Afghan women, a history of struggle, in person, I guess, on October 8th at the Cinema Village Theater in Manhattan, and also at Workers Unite Filmfestival.org. It'll be streaming. Did I get that right, Kathleen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I guess we'd like to thank everybody.
It's 9 o'clock.
Well, it's not 9 o'clock, but we don't seem to have questions. I think it was very interesting. I read a lot, but I feel I learned things new in this discussion. I'd like to thank particularly our panelists and our video maker panelist, Kathleen Foster, Murtaza Delary, and Brittany DeBarros, because I think they all contributed a lot. And I hope we can go on to try to learn about this and what's going on. I think I'd like to just bring up the thing is it's great when wars end, but it scared me when Joe Biden said, we're doing this to concentrate on China and Russia. So that may be as great a threat as climate change. And I say that after I finished cleaning out my basement for the last week. After a foot of water for the first time in 43 years. So.
Yeah, I especially want to thank Mortaza because he has, he seemed to have, I don't know when you left Afghanistan, but you seem to have a lot of connections with people, contacts with people, and you gave us a really good picture of what's going on. And I thought that your perspective on, I hadn't really thought about why was it so easy for the Taliban why did they have such easy access to Kabul? And I think that maybe I'm cynical, but this was a deal that was made with the US, that had been made with the US over a number of years. This is not a new, and it's, I don't think the US, I think the US at the expense of the Afghan people let the Taliban in. And I don't know about the argument about fundamentalism versus not fundamentalism, whether it's a Western, but I see them as basically fascists who use the question of women as a way to it seems like every country there's racism, there's the people in power divide people, and the people in the women and men of Afghanistan have common interests, and they're using sexism to make men feel that they're superior to women so that they can control the men, and the rulers, the rich people, can control the men and control the country and have a class society where the rich control everything again. So I think that's, and that the Taliban is using sexism to do that. And they're fascists, just like we have sexism in the United States.
And I want to add one more thing. A lot of people, they don't know, like Afghanistan is a heterogeneous society, as Dr. He kind of indicated. Afghanistan is a heterogeneous society, and it has many ethnic groups. Even the question that you guys had, if it's going to be end of a war, even if it's going to be end of a war for the United States, it's not going to be most likely an end of war for Afghans.
Correct.
This war will continue because right now the Taliban just representing just one ethnic in Afghanistan. And while they promise that they're going to form an inclusive government, but right now the government that they announced, it is just all from one tribe and representing all the Taliban leadership. And that they did not commit or honor whatever they promised. So the rest of the Afghans will not let that to be continued again to just one group, just lead, 36 million people there. So now it might be an end of war for United States, but it's not going to be a end of war for Afghans. This war is going to continue as the resistance is going to gain momentum again from the northern Afghanistan. As as even they try to get rid of it through Pakistani force. There's evidence that the Pakistani was involved when they attacked Panjshir province, but the resistance is still there, and it's going to gain momentum soon. So it's not going to be end of war for Afghanistan again.
Kathleen?
No, I just thought what he said was so apt. Well, what about Karzai? Where is his position? Can you hear me? Karzai.
President Karzai, he's right now in Kabul. He is trying to promote peace. He's trying to encourage all the parties to, even he encouraged the Taliban to, but to form an inclusive government, but the Taliban denied that, and he's not happy right now about it. Even at the beginning of his regime, his government, he kind of protected. He provided some sort of level of protection to Taliban, but he thought that he was going to have an influence over the Taliban, but that's not going to happen. They totally denied his vision and whatever he suggested to form, at least some type of inclusive government that could represent all Afghans.
I guess that's it. And we want to thank everybody. Meeting
Very
went
illuminating.
very illuminating, very interesting. And
I'm sorry, I know we're ending. I'm going to add one more thing. Of course, regime change has been the norm in Afghanistan. For the past 40 years, 4 decades, Afghanistan already experienced 4 regimes. So it is that regime change is a norm. It's all political games. We all know that. And I know that. Everybody knows that. Every Afghan knows that. That's a political game. Whoever is serving a purpose, they will be in power. And none of these regimes has been independent. And they've all been, every government, every regime has a master outside of Afghanistan. So that is the reality. But my concern as an Afghan, as someone who raised in Afghanistan, as someone who basically lived in Afghanistan, I want my people to be protected. I want my people to have freedom, right? I want them to be happy. I want them to be, have liberty, and I want them to live in peace and prosperity like the rest of the world. That's what matters to me. And if we talk about politics, then we can talk about politics for hours, and we're not going to get anywhere. My main concern is right now the people of Afghanistan. That's who I represent. That's what I'm talking about the most. That's where because that's where I'm coming from.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Just so many things to think about, and I think, if anyone knows, I think that Kathleen's suggestion was, of knowing someone personally who is trying to help the Afghan people directly. If people know of groups like that, that would be great. If, they contacted Peace Action, or they put it in the chat right now, and maybe we can help some people, and I think I learned a lot today, and I'm glad that we had this, and I learned a lot from different people's perspectives, and I hope that the Afghan people can somehow, I think just like people all over working people all over the world deserve, education, health. Maybe someday we'll have a world like that where people have equality and get their needs met. So that's all to say.
All right, so I'll stop the recording now. Thank you. Or you could stick around if you want for a second, but we won't be recording.